We're here today as part of the South Australia's History Festival, and we're joined by Professor Martin Shanahan and Professor Hamish Maxwell-Stewart. Their project, A Tale of Two Cities, looks to compare the life forces of settler generations in Hobart and Adelaide in the 19th century. Welcome, Martin and Hamish.
Thank you. My name's Martin Shanahan, and together with Hamish and a number of people who are in the audience, we have been beginning the work of a project that was funded by the Australian Research Council called A Tale of Two Cities, where we are looking at long-run social mobility in Australia. We chose A Tale of Two Cities because it has resonance with other literature, but as a first point of comparison, what we are going to be doing is building on 20 plus years of work from Hamish, looking in Tasmania and looking at the records in Tasmania, and we're now wanting to extend that to South Australia. And one of the very obvious and immediate comparisons is between Hobart and Adelaide. So hence the tale of two cities. And what we've got on the screen there is just some of the typical lithographic drawings of the time to try and give a flavour to that. I'd like to emphasise the number of groups and supporters that are involved with this particular project. We have 3 universities, Adelaide University, University of New England and Monash University, where we have scholars working. And then we have, as community partners, obviously Genealogy SA, but also state records for the archives. There isn't actually a label for births, deaths and marriages. They come under consumer and business services these days, so that's their symbol. The State Library, and then the group that was established by Hamish, the Digital History Tasmania group, who are also integral to this project. So there's a lot of people involved and a lot of both paid and volunteer work going into this particular project. So what are the ambitions of the project? The project aims to look at creating a database of life course events between individuals in the colonies of South Australia and Van Diemen's Land or Tasmania. What makes this project different is that we are going down to the individual level. We're trying to move away from the aggregate parliamentary papers level of reports, annual reports. We're going down to who was born, who died, who was married in each colony, what did they do during their lives, where did they live, what was the family like, what was the value of the property that they lived in, what types of jobs did they have. We're taking those things from the records. How are we doing that? By collecting the records. And we want to use that and use that information to do a direct comparison between those people who came to Australia as convicts, principally to Tasmania, and those who came as free settlers, both to Tasmania and to South Australia, to see, well, what was the long-term life outcomes, life opportunities for themselves and for their children as a consequence of those changes in their lives. In the course of doing this, as part of the process of doing this, and very important to this particular project, we are digitising and working with others who have already pulled together many records. We're digitising records and trying to pull these things together so that we can set up what's going to be called a data resource commons that is available for researchers in the long term, hopefully, maybe one day nationally. So we can establish standards of digitisation, standards of data cleaning, standards of connecting these records together in ways that are both safe, secure and accurate now and into the future. So in pictures, this is what we're trying to compare. The outcomes for European settlers in South Australia who came as free settlers and European settlers who were not free settlers, who were assisted in their passage, if you like to say, to Tasmania, but then to look down and track what was the consequence for them, where did they end up, where did their children end up, and over time, hopefully, where did their grandchildren end up, and what were the consequences of that. not just relying on the individuals and knowing something about them, but also what was the impact of different environments for those people. And what I have there in pictures is simply both poor housing and lovely housing in both Hobart and in Adelaide to, if you like, show the extreme differences, which we know were there, but also then what were the differences in those two colonies. What we've already partially done, what Hamish's teams have been doing for a number of years, is collect data. This was part of the application process that we put in, where we basically talked about what we had collected so far, what we intend to collect in the future. And Hamish is going to talk in much more detail about some of these issues in a moment. But you can see that what we're trying to do in the 4-year project that we have in front of us, we're going to be looking at everything from school records to street directories, birth, deaths and marriage records, tax records, what we can use that will identify individuals in both colonies. And essentially what we're doing is turning what's on the top left-hand corner of the screen into the bottom right-hand corner of the screen, hopefully. And as I said, Hamish will say a bit more about that. This is one of this is a screenshot that we'll see more about in a moment, but it's part of the process by which we're converting those paper records. Heidi, who I think many of you know, has been instrumental, and we have other people in the team, Trudy and others in the team, who have been working very hard for years on pulling these things together into a uniform data set, which will enable us to extract data eventually. But our intention is to bring the past into the present, or I'm trying to use with this illustration, the black and white two-dimensional understanding of history into a richer and fuller understanding of that history. It's early days in the project. We only really started getting funded from the start of this year. That's when the money first came in, even though it was approved last year. But in order to give you more of a flavour of what we're trying to do, and to also show you what we are building on already, what already exists, I'm going to hand over to Hamish, who is going to give you some real feel for the richness of what's already been done.
Can I start by saying what a pleasure it is to be in South Australia, and I'm sorry that I seem to have brought Tasmania's weather with me. I am so proud to be involved with this project. I think what we're talking about here is the start of a set of national infrastructure, which will be really, really critically important, particularly because of the advent of artificial intelligence. And I'll say more about that as we go on. What I'm going to do is to give you a whirlwind run. This is going to be a bit of a roller coaster through the Tasmanian data set. Now, we don't hold as many records as Genealogy Australia. We've only got 4 million. But those 4 million records are now revealing a pattern of Tasmanian history that we just couldn't contemplate exploring 5 years ago. So what we did was start in the early 2000s by digitizing Tasmania's World Heritage listed convict archive. We imaged it and we started transcribing it. We're still transcribing those records. The offence records alone, so the summary of each magistrate bench encounters, have over 500,000 lines in them. We have completed 350,000 of those transcriptions to date. So having got the basic convict records together, we've then gone backwards into British and Irish records. So we're starting to connect people to their early lives. And I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. And then outrageously, we went forwards. So we now have death records transcribed for Tasmania up until 1969. So this is the year before digital data is available through government system. Tasmania now has the longest run of fully digitized death certificates in the English-speaking world. This means you can do intergenerational research in Tasmania, which you can't do elsewhere. We want to give more power to that by adding the South Australian data. You can see other records here. We have property valuations, 500,000 of them, up until 1905. We have admissions to various institutions, discharges from those institutions. Critically, we have the attestation papers of the 15,000 Tasmanian born who served in the First World War, all of which underwent a medical, which is quite similar to the examination that was performed on convicts on arrival in Australia. So, for example, we have their heights and things like that. I think it's important that any project like this works very closely with the custodians of the original records. And when we do that, when we get that relationship right, something magical happens. My archival fellow researchers tell me that an archival record actually starts as a document, and it only becomes a record when you attach a description to the document. So it's the document, the original thing that you look at on a shelf, and then it's the description of what the contents are, which makes an archival record. What we're effectively doing is imaging those records. And one of the first things that we did in 2006-07 was to photograph every single convict record and make those publicly available. And then we transcribe the digital image, and we try and make that transcription as close to what's in the original record as possible. So we keep the abbreviations, we keep all the misspellings, we keep the mistakes. And then we clean that transcript. And then what we do is we code the transcript. And as we code it, we form a thing called a coding dictionary. Now, these are very important because it means that the coding dictionaries for occupations has taken years to assemble. It can now be used to mark up South Australian records in a nanosecond. I'll talk more about that in a bit. We can then apply those codes to the transcript, and then we can form a digital index. We can go back and retract back to the archives and make Australia's archive more discoverable. This is a virtuous circle. One of the critical things in this is that coding dictionary. And this one is our offence coding dictionary. So it's every single offence we've ever encountered and the way that we have coded it. We can run that, if we code find a whole lot more offence data, we can match that to the data set, to our dictionary that we've already got. It will code everything that it can see and tell us everything that is new. And then we can add that to the coding dictionary. If we decide we want to enter it, we want to develop a new code, we add it to the dictionary, and every file that's linked to that dictionary changes in step. So these are huge advantages. This is the advantage of this being systematic about the way that we go about things. I like to think of what we're doing as the excavation of the archive. We're transcribing whole record series. We're not leaving anything out. We can now see the gaps in the archive. So the unregistered civil births that have, for example, a Catholic birth record. That's an important thing to know. We can put every suburb in perspective by looking at those kids who are born, or the marriages that happen in that suburb, or the deaths compared to another one. We can do the same for a street and for a household. What effectively we're doing is that we're establishing a frame for the archive. Another way of looking at this is that what we're doing is cementing the provenance of the nation, that we're systematically going through the archival records of Australia and piecing them together bit by bit. This is a screenshot from one of the Tasmanian data sets, and it's a very good way of illustrating how this process actually works. We have white fields. These are supposed to be an exact representation, as close as we can get, of what's in the original record. We even have codes for the original was written in red ink or in pencil, or it was crossed out. And then the green field is where we've cleaned that data. So we've elongated abbreviations, we've standardized things. And then the yellow are the IDs that we've attached to those records. So every record has its own unique identifier. Every person has their own ID. Every business has their own ID. Every street in Tasmania now has its own ID. And that allows us to do things like this. So this is our employers data set. These are all of the people that employ convicts. We have 27,000 records in this. Some of them are the same because we have a Mr. Haig and a Mr. John Haig. We're reluctant to assume that they're the same person, but over time we find that they are, and then we join them together. That links to the Australian Dictionary of Biography. So if there's a person in there that's got a link to another repository somewhere, we've got that link captured. This record here is for William Race Allison. So I can now tell you that there are 186 convicts in our probation wage earning data set who signed contract with William Race Allison. So we know how long they worked for him and how much they were paid. And of course, we know their ages, their sex, whether they could read and write, which religion they were, and what their occupation was when they arrived. And we can also pull up the original. So if you think the transcribers made an error, if the record is incorrectly transcribed, you can always see it. You can always unwind the process. And then we can also link and see Allison in the 1843 census, where all the convicts who were in his household would just appear as a number. But now we can actually have a guess at putting the names to them. This is another screenshot of a record of an individual. Now you can sort this by status, you can sort it by native born. In the case of immigrants, you can sort them by the type of immigrant that they came. So convict, assisted migrant, another free. It will produce a life course for every individual. This one was actually transported twice. So transported, became free, went back to the UK, was convicted again of stealing a pig, came out. You would have thought that was a disaster story. But in fact, you can see down here that when he got married in 1871, he's listed on the marriage certificate as a gentleman. So is he lying? Well, the interesting thing is that he has two children we've now linked to him. One of the children dies in Victoria. So we've actually managed to link this across colonial boundaries. But we can also link to the 1870 valuation, where we can see that, in fact, he does have a property at White Hills in Evandale, just south of Launceston, which is 215 acres in size, and it's valued at £130. It probably did qualify as a gentleman. He certainly was a medium-sized farmer by Tasmanian standards. We are making some use of AI and machine learning now. We're going to be very careful about how we do this, but this is an illustration of the kind of magic that can now happen. This is a project run by one of our researchers called Paul Wilson, who has used machine learning to strip the indexes of the Tasmanian government gazette. Every single one of those, 130,000 rows of data in the indexes. So now we know which entry is in which volume, and we have the volumes digitized in the State Archive. And so at the moment, we're setting up a system where you can jump from our archive, from our data set, to the page of the record where that entry lines up. We can then we do another exercise where we strip the text out and we align it with other records in the data set. So this is just a page of that looking at John Barber. These are all of the John Barbers that are in the Tasmanian Government Gazette. Every single person who's on the government payroll appears in the Gazette, usually multiple times. So we can link that to births, deaths, and marriages. And these are all the different subject headings and the years in which they appear in the Government Gazette. This was all done using machine learning. It would have taken years of labour to do. And this project was done in a matter of weeks. Organising data spatially is really difficult. It takes a lot of time, but my goodness, the rewards are fantastic. So this is an employer record in our database. We got, saying earlier, the 27,000 of them. This is the location ID for that employer. One of the locations the employer is associated with, they're often associated with more than one. What we've done is we've nested it within its street, its parish, its district, its hundred, its county. And so now we can map all of those places. And we know the administrative districts that they lie in, so we can map them to other records. We have now geolocated over 26,000 of those 27,000 employers. We can drop a pin on a map and say that's there, and we can tell you how accurately we think that we've mapped them. So there's an opportunity to go in here and look at the ones that we've got low quality mapping scores on. And you can have a team that can then try and improve those findings. We've now digitized every building in Hobart and every block that it sits on, and every block and every street, and also geographical features like the rivulet. This is a map of Hobart in 1847 linked to property valuations, which are linked to other records. Every green cross is somebody who was born in the colony or arrived free. Every red cross is a former convict. We're starting to map class across Hobart. We're starting to understand the businesses that were formed by former convicts and the ones that were formed by people who were always free. This is from, this is again 1847. These are the value of properties in Hobart from the valuation records. We'll talk very briefly about what we've done with convict records. This is the record for Hannah Riles, who was transported age 15 from Staffordshire. Up there is her police number, the unique identifier that was given by the convict administration. And here is the details of where she was tried and her offence and her confession taken on arrival. Here is also her jail report that was forwarded from Britain. Here is the summary of every magistrate's bench charge that she faced. And then we can enumerate them. There's 6 of them. So it's about average for a female convict. And here is a note on tickets of leave and conditional pardons, and down here the places that she was rationed. All of this is now digitized. We can take this one line of this, here it is, and we can mark it up. And then that allows us to do this. Bearing in mind that we've now got 350,000 of these. Marked up record, we can identify the masters that she was assigned to at his property and where that was located. And we know all of the other convicts that were working on that property at the same day. And that's the magistrate that heard her case. That's where he lived. We can also work out how many other times he intervened on that property and tried other convicts. That's the road that she was walked down to go to the female factory. And I can tell you if it was raining on that day and which direction the wind was going. We've got the weather data out of the newspapers. So this is what happens when you bring lots and lots of data together, but you've got structure. It's not just names and words, but there's an underlying shared structure across those different records. And so that we could take this one step further. So this is Monica Schwartz, who works at Sensory Lab at Monash University. Absolute genius, trained as an archaeologist. She's now a data programmer and visualizer. So this is Hannah Riles' record on a timeline. But now we've brought in the births, deaths, and marriages. So you can see when her kids were born. So these are all of her punishments. This is a marriage. You know, she's got some children born before the marriage and some afterwards. But we know the person that she married, Jeremiah Callaghan, was in the field police in the Hamilton district where she had that last child. He was probably the constable that marched her down the road. So those kind of insights that you wouldn't get without mashing together multiple records, you can now pull out of this. We can put individual family stories into context. And we can also do the big picture as well. So I like giving this or reading this quote out because it shows the way in which what I call convictism was used to justify convict labor exploitation. So the idea that if you've been convicted, then it was okay to punish you for failing to work hard enough for a master. So George Arthur, Lieutenant Governor of Van Diemen's Land, said, "The master may draw from his knowledge of their crimes a sanction as satisfactory as that arising from difference of colour for any severity who were practiced against him." And of course, what his reference point here is West Indian slavery. So the master of the slave is justified in pushing the slave to work for no wage because they are African, in the same way as the master in Van Diemen's Land could do the same thing to their assigned servant because they have been convicted. And what we have tried to show is that when we take all of these records, which were meant to show the guilt, the conviction history of the prisoner, and put them all together, then we decenter the prisoner. The individual record was supposed to have the prisoner at the center, but collectively the digitized archive puts the state in the center. We can now use those individual records to show how convicts were prosecuted over time. And other things are revealed. One of the things that we're starting to say is that the British stole time from thieves in order to steal a continent. What do we mean by that? Well, those convicts were asked to list all of their previous convictions. Now, I won't go into why we think they they largely told the truth, but if in questions, I can tell you the checks that we've run on this data. This is the average amount of time that they spent in British institutions for prior convictions. This is what happened when they got sentenced to transportation. The minimum sentence to transportation was 7 years in order to make the convict more exploitable. The problem with transportation is the severity with which you're punished did not necessarily match the severity of the offence that you were being transported for. It reflected how useful you were to a colonial master. And we can put a sum on what that was worth to the economy, because maintaining a convict cost 59% of a pastoral worker's wage. So that's the cost of feeding and clothing them. So the difference, about £14 million in 19th century terms, went to private sector employers. We've done this for the first time out of the database. Wanted to do this for years. One of my colleagues, Richard Tucken, and a postgraduate student, Roxanne Giles, and myself have managed to now model the number of convicts. This is male convicts. We've done something similar for female convicts that were in different sections of the convict system. So at the top, the light green is ticket of leave holders. And then we have assigned convicts who later in the 1840s became pass holders. And then we have skilled public works, then those that are in road gangs, those that are in chain gangs, those that are down at the coal mines on the Tasman Peninsula, and then various penal stations, and then right at the bottom in hospital. So we can now work out those undergoing punishment at any one point in time, and those that are not. We know that's the assignment and probation, but we also know those that are in the private sector and those that are in the public sector. And our image of convict transportation instantly changes. Most people think that Port Arthur is the typical kind of convict experience. The vast majority of convicts were working on farms or were in urban businesses. And I think that that's something that we can use the data set to tell that, and that's a wild story. And then we can put extra meaning on that. So this is the mean number of days a male convict spent undergoing punishment on the roads of Van Diemen's Land. Blue is in chains, green is not in chains over time. So by the end of the transportation period, on average, male convicts are spending 50 days labouring in the public works. This is how much it costs to clothe and feed a convict. So what we're seeing is as the cost of clothing and feeding a convict rises, more convicts are sent to the magistrate's bench, and the magistrate's bench is sending them to the road and chain gangs so that the state pays the extra rationing cost. And when it flips the other way, it goes back. This is responsible for 60%. So the changes in the background costs of maintaining labour is responsible for 60% of the rise or fall in the number of prosecutions of convicts each year. We're seeing something that we weren't supposed to see. We're seeing something that wasn't even hidden. Nobody could work this out. This is the market influencing Tasmanian transportation. But for the descendants of convicts, this matters intensely. It means the length of the number of charges on your ancestors' record is a poor guide to whether they were good or bad. But it's a good guide to how skilled and useful they were. This, by the way, is the death rate over that same period, because if you group convicts together, you put them in barracks, you increase the infection rate. This is Monica's work again. This is 23,000 convict absconding notices animated. But now that we know we have the geolocations of the masters that they were employed with, we can now do this, which allows us to see the places that they were running away from, so that we can now start to model the convict system. And I'm now going to talk a little bit about some of the ways in which we're taking the insights of the database in Tasmania out to the public. So this is not individual level data. This is using the data in order to change people's views or or get them to question what they thought they knew about the transportation system. So this is shots from an exhibition that was at the Tasmanian Museum and Art Gallery, seen by 40,000 people. This is this will play. This is one of our visualizations we put together, looking at collective actions by female convicts in female factories across Van Diemen's Land. We're now putting things down on people's phones. So it's possible to go to one site, interact with that site, and then walk into another one, and the other site picks up what's on your phone, and then picks up with the story that you're interested in. There are huge opportunities here to use a digitized archive to reconnect people with our heritage and our past. I won't get into the details of all of this, but the Digital History Tasmania database speaks on a weekly basis to a convict memorial we built with the National Trust and the Tasmanian government. So as there's more data that goes in, the experience that you have interacting with the memorial changes. That memorial tries to visualize every convict. Some of them are easy. This is Alexander Pierce, the monster pin-up boy of the convict system. He's the cannibal who escaped from Macquarie Harbour twice and ate people. Until we did this, we didn't realize that he also played Frodo in Lord of the Rings. But it's actually quite shocking to see this person that's been so demonized and take the drawing done by Thomas Bock post-execution and then use the power of AI and it's picking up on Alexander Pierce's physical description and then turning that into an image. And of course, what we're trying to challenge is people's preconceptions that people with criminal history are not quite fully human. This is a contemporary illustration of convicts outside Hyde Park Barracks in Sydney. We've actually done one of these exercises with Michael Heath, who's here, who did the first of these. We're putting a photograph of Michael Heath in to try and visualize what his ancestor might have looked like. This is a Welsh convict, Anne Williams. We've put her physical description into this, so you can see the colour of her eyes, her encounter with smallpox there. But also, we've now got a complete set of photographs for her daughter, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and great-great-granddaughter. Down one line, have fed into this reconstruction. We now have the capacity in the database to take images in, attach them to a person, and then the convict memorial will automatically feed them into the facial reconstruction. We've created a time machine which will never get back to the past, but will travel back towards it more steadily every year. These are some of the convicts that worked at Frickenden Estate, which is on the World Heritage Register, reconstructed using that process. And I got very close to the end, and I'm going to hand back to Martin at the end. But I just want to say some things about where this could go. We're now experimenting with animating those photographs. We have a principle, which is that we will never put words into their mouths. These are their own recorded statements. But here's a little snippet of what we have done. So the first one is Linus Miller, who was a Yankee. He was from upstate New York. He was transported for invading Canada.
And their faces pale with hunger and despair.
I rose before the sun and scrubbed floors till my hands bled. My mistress struck me for speaking back. I was not lazy, only tired.
It was a place of horror. We were worked like beasts and fed worse. Men went mad with hunger.
And that figure, you're seeing this for the first time. We had no idea how much hard labour was extracted from convicts. I can also tell you that nearly 1.5 million strokes of the lag fell across male convicts' backs in Van Diemen's Land, and that men and women served 800,000 days in solitary confinement. We now know, because of the longitudinal research that we've done, that every day a female convict served in solitary reduced her life expectancy by 10 days. This is coming out of the archive. That matters. It's part of our story. It's part of the intergenerational shaping of the nation. Now, I'm going to end by showing some things that haven't happened yet, but I really, really want to make this happen. I want to make it happen in Tasmania and South Australia and at the National Library. I want archival finding aids like this one. Wouldn't that be good? We can certainly do things like that. I think also we shouldn't limit our ambitions to archival records. One of the violent things that we have managed to do as historians, archivists, curators, heritage site managers is split up the various traces of the past and put them into different collections. By creating common data sets which link those things, we can reunite things like the powder horn in the centre with the archival record of the person who made it. Edward Batchelor was a corporal in the 4th Regiment who served at Cox's River Stockade in New South Wales and married a former female convict and settled in New South Wales. We've now got a history to that object. And we can obviously take the data out of a research data set and use it to populate sites like Hyde Park Barracks that are on the World Heritage Register. So I'm going to end by giving you an idea of how things are shaping up in Tasmania. Now, Tasmania is different from South Australia. It has something called the Tasmanian Archives Act, which as far as we can work out is unique. It's a criminal offence in Tasmania to put a public record behind a paywall unless there is a free copy available, which means there are things that we can't do in Tasmania, which you can do here, and vice versa. So the landscape is not the same, but that's a caveat to showing where we can go. I think it's going to be possible to do something very similar to this. Digital History Tasmania is a not-for-profit. Anybody can join. I encourage you all to join. It's free. It's a collection of family historians, researchers, curators, and archivists who have worked with the Australian Research Council. We now have 20 Australian Research Council grants going back to 1992 that have helped to digitise the Tasmanian archive. Lots of volunteer labour from family historians as well. That digitised data has been used to improve the Tasmanian Name Index, which is the way that the public interact with records. Digital History Tasmania is not open to the public for very, very simple reasons. It's a research data set, and it's not there to undercut the job of the Tasmanian Archives. What it does is facilitate public access to records. So we meet with, in fact, on our board, we have one of the archivists on our board. But we have a special relationship with the family history associations. They should have access to the back end because all of that rich, complicated data matters to family historians. Also, we have 40 volunteer family historians who pump data into our data sets all the time and help to improve them. And then finally, we have a set of experiences all under the label of Unshackled. Unshackled, we like to think of as unshackling Tasmania's archive, which are linked to museums and heritage sites, which are powering new ways of using data in order to change the way that people feel about the past. Now, the last thing I'm going to say before quickly handing back to Martin, who's going to actually look at the questions that are going to drive us forward, the things that we need to collectively solve, is to talk about a sister project. So as well as the Tale of Two Cities, we have another grant up between UNE and the University of Technology, Sydney, which you need to know about because it will run parallel over the next 4 years. It's called the impact of forced migration. And what it's doing is following the brothers and sisters of convicts who were named on arrival. Convicts were asked to name their next of kin, but of course were never transported. And so what we want to do is use the reconstructed life courses of these brothers and sisters to control for the shared environmental conditions. They were both, you have a brother transported and a brother who remains behind in Manchester. So you know that they both shared those conditions, and they also share genetics. So it means that we have got now, for the first time, a way of really drilling into the degree to which being transported to Tasmania shortened or extended your life expectancy. And then we can use that to see whether there were long-term intergenerational effects associated with solitary confinement and flogging. And that very much is a question which A Tale of Two Cities is also interested in.
Thanks, Hamish. And I think you all realise why me and my colleagues in South Australia are so excited by being involved with this particular project, because of the potential it has for South Australia, but also for Australia in terms of understanding our history. But having said all that, there are a few challenges. And at the moment, that's what we've been spending quite a bit of time dealing with. And some of them are quite difficult, and we are feeling our way carefully, but we want to get it right. So we're going to take our time. Obviously, one of the biggest problems with the historical record, particularly birth, death, marriages, and official European written records, is the omission or sometimes inclusion, in the way they were included, of Indigenous people. And we are in the process of getting an advisory board to assist us with that particular aspect of how we treat the data, how it is to be protected, etc. But as you would appreciate, it's both ethically, morally challenging, and we need to go carefully. Hamish has talked quite quickly, I'll say, the difficulties of cleaning, getting accuracy is always there. I know Genealogy SA has a very good system of checking and rechecking, and that's basic. You have to be doing that. But it's as you get the data set larger, and particularly as you start to say, well, we'll link this ID number with this ID number, you've got to be even more sure that the ID numbers are accurate, the things behind them are accurate. So there's always a challenge of accuracy in that recording, and then accuracy in linking. And we've actually, in the last, well, more than a few months, but we've been turning our attention to how to improve the linking process. This is happening all around the world with data sets at the moment, and there's various methods being used. The volunteer approach can be very careful with, and it is sort of like first class when you do it extremely carefully with lots of checking, but you don't get through 6 million records very quickly if you're doing it by hand. So it's always a trade-off. And again, that's part of what you have to make decisions about, and how you go about doing that type of linking. And then once you've done all of that, you can start to answer questions such as Hamish has touched on about, well, what is your interpretation of what actually happened? Is the stories that we've been told about the history of South Australia or Tasmania, does that align with what we can put together when we pull all these pieces together in a way that hasn't been done before? And so there is a huge amount of data to collect. We're in the early stages in South Australia, but we're extremely excited by the potential for this to build going forward from this point on, and we're working hard to do it.
We can start with some of the questions from our online audience. Marissa asks that you were referring to private school admissions in Tasmania. Will you be also referring to South Australian private school admissions?
Yes.
Yes. The South Australian school records are so much better than the Tasmanian. So I think one of the problems that we're going to face is we've not got universal record coverage. What we want to do is try and turn that into an advantage. We've got good private school coverage in Tasmania, not good for public schools. But South Australia, very different.
Question from Beth Robertson, who notes that there are, of course, photographs of some convicts, including some who came to South Australia and have been identified in the Old Colonist Photographic Mosaic collection. How do you run comparisons of using AI to create facial images with those tools without feeding in the actual photograph and then comparing it to the photo to see what it produces?
We haven't yet, but it's on the to-do list. So it's a fairly obvious, well, I think it's a fairly obvious thing to do, but it's something that we should do. So there's quite a bit of programming to do because we're going to have to age our likeness of a convict. So they won't be at 18, they will be at 70 or whatever. But yes, we will do that.
Very cool. Just to follow up on the private school records, which private school records in South Australia do you have access to?
St. Peter's is one I'm being whispered from Heidi, thank you. But I think we begin with what's in the public record, what's available in the State Library, what's available in the archives, and then we go from there in terms of approaching people.
And I might just, the one that we're looking at in Tasmania, we just started to line up with digitisation is Hutchins. And the Hutchins admission roll going back into the 1840s lists the father and their address.
Do you have any interest in the methods and findings associated with demographic studies of the United States covering the antebellum period and post-Civil War era?
Yes.
Awesome.
You want me to say a little bit more here?
Yeah, please speak to it. Yeah.
One of the key studies that motivated us is the Union Army study. This is a big research project looking at what happened to Union Army soldiers who survived the Civil War. One of its very dramatic findings is that the life expectancy of those soldiers is very closely associated with the number of casualties, inversely associated with the number of casualties at the battles that they were present at. Not particularly surprising. What was surprising is the same is true of their sons. And it's those kind of terrifying thoughts that motivate a lot of our Tasmanian research. So if flogging shortens life expectancy, and our early indications is that it does quite severely, does it shorten the life expectancy of the sons and daughters? And if it does, why? Is it because the father's socioeconomic opportunities are shredded by being a former convict? Or is it because of gene-environment interactions? So chemically coated chromosomes because of the trauma that you experience as a convict, which is then inherited by your kids. There are so few ways of studying this kind of stuff without going into the archive. And Australia has one of the great archives to study it. But we can't do this without having an international comparison. So that's why we were interested in those records.
That's fantastic.
And I could add to that because we are interested in many studies around the world, there are a number of areas around the world, not just, Australia's been fortunate in that we have been affected by wars in different ways, but there's plenty of research now that looks at the impact of famines on children's heights, but not because the child was affected by the famine, but because their mother or their grandmother was affected by the famine. And that has been passed on through the genes. So we can look at different issues, people coming from other countries who've been subjected to that, or their parents have been subjected to particular events. What were the consequences for them? As you pull this data together in a way that allows you to make the linkages and the connections, you can start to ask and potentially answer some of those questions to see the impact of what's happened in Australia, but also what's been happening in other countries, because so many of us have backgrounds of parents, grandparents and great-grandparents who've come from overseas. Not to mention, and this is again one of the omissions we're very aware of, not to mention the Indigenous population and the impact that we had on them in the world.
We have a couple of questions asking how the project will deal with the presence of Tasmanian ex-convicts who moved to South Australia who will be present in both data sets.
We want to find them. We
Absolutely.
want to track them down. And hopefully we can by names and the connections that we will be able to have on where they were born, where they married, who their parents were. It's a detective exercise, and that's one of the great things about this job, that you get to play detective every day. But that where we can, we will be trying to piece those things together to answer exactly that question. And we're hoping, fingers crossed, in the sense where when we start putting together ship arrivals, now ship departures, which we just learnt have been recorded, newspaper, government gazette records, all these things help us find those people in a way that previously we were unable to find.
Fantastic. A question from Liz, who says, hi, as a December 17 UTAS graduate, who's asking, is there a way to access your compiled database?
Yes. Now, this is going to be different for Tasmania and South Australia. The plan at the moment is that the access to the South Australian data will be through genealogy South Australia.
Please join.
Yeah. So one of the motivating factors is join. If you want access to research data sets of this quality, join your local family history society. In Tasmania, it is slightly different because of the Tasmanian Archives Act. At the moment, you send me an email and I propose your membership to the board. We haven't actually rejected anybody yet. There is an expectation that anybody who joins is either going to use the data in some meaningful way, treat it like a library, take it out, enrich it, put it back, or will volunteer at least a few hours a year to help improve the quality of the data. And we have a volunteer coordinator and training programs and all the rest of it. You also get access to a newsletter, which we're going to run across both projects and other bits and pieces. But you send me an email.
We'll make sure we include this in the email that we send out with the recording.
And I would also add to that, because we are very conscious of things like AI and scrapings, etc., there will be quite some security around access to information. There'll be we'll be keeping a very close eye on how and who accesses the data and for what purposes, and we will be jealous of its use. We want people to use it for for good things, or I was almost going to quote President Trump and say the good guys get to use it and the bad guys don't, but that's what we're being careful about.
We are hoping that this will end up as a national system. We're hoping that because the digital archive that we will create will have what's called a persistent identifier all the way through it. It will be impossible for anybody to invent in a credible way the history of Australia using AI. And this is really important. I like quoting George Orwell here. George Orwell was very conscious of the role that history plays in politics. And so he said, they who control the past controls the future. They who control the present controls the past. I want to make sure that Australian citizens control their own past. And I think that we can do this if the academic community works hand in hand with family historians. This is possible.
I have a question from Ross, who says, much of the information on the web is fluid. Some is disappearing from easy access, and others are being modified, like Wikipedia or family trees. How does your project sort of capture these databases and keep up to date as these sites are changed or updated?
It doesn't, but this is a very live problem. So there are archives that are trying to capture websites and keep track of them and keep track of how they change. What we want to do is to make sure that when a research project is undertaken, the results of that project remain in a research data commons. I had actually a very good illustration. I'm talking to some of my colleagues about this. I heard at a family history conference. Person put up two slides. One was a really grainy shot of a microfilm record that had been taken in 1970, and one was a shot of the same record taken a month ago. So it was really clear the record was in the UK archive, except between 1970 and here, the spine has cracked, and you can't read the centre of the record. You can from the microfilm. So this is what we are doing will solve some of those issues, but we will have to work with other groups in order to solve the really live issue about keeping digital data going. But we can at least make sure that our digital records are held safe in a way where we can document change, etc., etc.
Michael Heath, I was just wondering, we have a plan to access the South Australian birth marriages, but I know they're behind. We've got records here on your microfilm, but they're not freely available like the ones in Tasmania, and obviously they're a very important part of the records for individuals. Yeah, just wondering how you can approach that.
Yes, so I'm going to speak more generally here because each state has different provisions for births, deaths, and marriages. In South Australia, we are working obviously with Genealogy South Australia first and foremost, but also with the registrar. Loosely speaking, what we are planning is the enriched data will be available to Genealogy South Australian members. That there will be a public version that will be available through the registry, but that will not be anywhere near as detailed as the one that's available for Genealogy South Australia. What we're trying to do is to create a relationship with family historians whereby there is a huge incentive to join your local family history society, that you'll get an Australian version of Ancestry that knocks Ancestry right out of the park. In fact, I mean, I probably shouldn't do this on a recording, but I would love to make Ancestry go bust in Australia. Because I think we can do a much, much better job, and a job that does a much better public good. But we do have to approach all of this very, very carefully. We have to make sure that everybody's interests are safeguarded.
I'm not standing on the cross, sorry. When you say access to Genealogy SA members, do you mean like only in person, or would that be available online?
That's up to Genealogy South Australia. At the moment, you can access the Tasmanian version if you have a login to Digital History Tasmania. You can see virtually everything, but we do lock down PhD projects and we lock down First Nation records, and we can lock down other sensitive data. So we have the ability to keep things concealed where there is an ethics issue, or somebody is working on if they're working on their own PhD. There's fairly obvious reasons why you don't want somebody else to see that. But generally speaking, the view that we have is that sharing data, at least within the research community, is a really good way of keeping it alive and making sure that it's got a life beyond the project.
Any other questions? Come on down.
I just have a question about people with disabilities, because I'm interested in the deaf community in South Australia and also across Australia. And if with a database, you can actually pick out who the deaf people are, because I can look at birth, deaths, and marriages. And the only way in South Australia I know that they're probably deaf is if they got married in the deaf and done church in 1905, whereas you can't pick them out from anywhere else. And we don't have census records that tell us if, this is for historical purposes. So, yeah.
Yeah, some of these questions we can get by just linking tons of records together.
Yeah.
And every record that you bring, this is not 1 + 1. This is 1 + 1 + 1 = 2. This is going to be 1 + 1 = 3, 4, 5, 6. That every record that we bring in will allow us to answer questions we couldn't have done before. And yeah, that's a really, really good example.
So yes, if we could find records of some of the schools assisting the deaf, and they had student records and names. In due course, we should be able to match those people against other points in the system. That's how we'd have to do it.
The original annual report for the Institute for the Deaf, done online, institution in South Australia, actually include all of the kids who are registered, and so the ones in New South Wales. And I presume that they did them across Australia. So there, because they did them in the UK as well.
Well, one of the advantages of that of doing any of this work in Australia, which Hamish has touched on just a little bit, we have the wonderful inheritance of having a public sector system that used pretty uniform records based on English-based systems, that was reasonably uniform between the colonies, even though they were independent, which means that often we go looking for things not knowing whether they exist or not, but saying, well, they must exist in colony New South Wales because they existed in South Australia, and often we're right. So again, the hope is that over time, these pieces can be pulled together. But the other advantage, of course, we haven't had the devastating bombings and other events that have destroyed centuries of records in the way that's happened overseas. So again, we get the advantage of a lot of these records still being in existence and accessible to us.
And sorry, I just wanted to get to what I think is Claire's bigger question, is that like it's not just going to come from birth, deaths and marriages. This data could be any data set, could be entered into, like if we had the annual report, say, for one, the deaf school.
Absolutely. I mean, we skipped over it. I skipped over it a bit quickly, but there's information in government gazettes, there's information in newspapers, there's information in private school records. What we mentioned in our grant application, we only have 4 years, so we just took a couple of the ones that we knew were in existence or were partially already begun, or that we thought we could get access to, or that had already been worked on in Tasmania that we could parallel. It doesn't mean that we're ultimately confined to that, but this is the 4-year window that we have at the moment and where we're starting. So you're quite right, there's many things that we could pull in.
Do you expect it to go further than 4 years?
Yes, in the sense it won't be this grant, but what we're hoping is that we're going to create an unfair advantage for South Australia. We know that we've done this for Tasmania. I don't want to tell you what my ARC success rate is. It's really embarrassing. And it's because we've kept data alive so that we don't have to start from ground zero the whole time. We can build on the last research question and ask something new that's right out there and cutting edge. And so I'm confident that if we get the architecture right, there will be further grant applications that will look at disability and social mobility and intergenerational inequality. They can target that because those records, or the base records, will be there in which to add new stuff to.
I've got a number of questions I've written down because I'm a convict family member from Tasmania. How do we get in touch with you? That a number of family historians who've already covered that, what you were saying and where we've gone. The other thing is industrial schools were here in South Australia is a big part of our tree, where they've come here and what have you. And also, there's a lot of things which haven't been recorded, like I've had to get from my family with properties and everything to sell, and they haven't been recorded as death or whatever. So that's been a bugbear. So how are you going to find that, like I did, through the cemetery to get a proof? And the other thing is, I'm a member of the Kangaroo Island Pioneers Association, and we have done extensive on our Aboriginals that have come to Kangaroo Island. So that might be another thing for you. Now we're joining the Pioneers Association.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, as I said, it's free to join Digital History Tasmania. We will circulate my email. So I'm the unpaid CEO of that, and I will find some time in an evening to give you all logins. We have there's a special place in the record where we can put family information from done by family historians. Then we can work through it. And where we have got official records, we will add all those. So just linking a convict to a death record is a really essential thing to do. And it's really, really difficult to do it without looking intensely at each one. Private records is a huge problem. We want to turn it into a huge advantage. So a state archive generally do not take private record holdings, but a system like this could. So we have to work out the IP related issues. So there'll have to be a form saying that you're donating a facsimile. But all of those images of people are now going to be, potentially really useful. All those family documents. We've created an electronic filing cabinet where we can potentially hold those. And yes, there is nothing to stop associations as well working with us to make sure that the records that they've collected go into a system which is going to look after them long term. And there are ways in which, if necessary, those records can be locked down within that system as well to protect IP, or if they've got sensitive information in them. So yeah, what we're trying to do is that there are going to be lots and lots of curly questions that come up. We can't think of one that we cannot solve with a common data standard. We can think of lots that are going to persist if we continue to have lots and lots of databases and museum and archival collections that don't talk to each other.
Another little curly question here. So unlike Tasmania, South Australia had many people coming overland to settle or worked over areas bordering Victoria and New South Wales. Are there significant records in these latter states being implemented in this project, or is that future looking?
Future looking.
Yep.
Absolutely. Outside of this scope.
Yeah, yes. I mean, as Hamish mentioned, we're really excited that South Australia gets to be next cab off the rank and builds on all the work that happened in Tasmania. Our hope is that this is the foundation for the rest of the nation, ultimately, in terms of coming in, and there's going to be negotiations at every step. But as we join up individuals and then we join up colonies, we get a better and better understanding of our history. And so yeah, we're just going 4 years at a time at the moment.
Absolutely.
So we just had our first national data set given to us. It was compiled by a researcher over 20 years. It's the record of 19th century trade union formation in Australia. That was in real danger of, it was on antiquated software. And so we're going to migrate it into the Digital History Tasmania database to keep it safe. I'm hoping there's going to be a lot more of that. The more records that we get talking to each other, the more that will attract. This will be a national system, and the great thing is that they'll be following South Australia's lead.
Fantastic. Yeah, and are you only looking at assisted migrants up to 1860, or does it go further?
Well, again, we've bitten off what we hope we can chew and swallow in the 4 years, but we do hope that in time it will go forward. But
what will define that is how long we can put together a death record, because we want to find out how long people live. So if we take assisted migrants to the late 19th century, we're going to have a death record which stretches deep into the 20th. If we keep the window shorter, it allows us to get research results out quicker.
Absolutely.
But the ambition is to get everything that we can in eventually.
Sorry, when you say that, do you mean like the present day, like to people who are descendants of convicts and descendants of free settlers today?
Every state has a data linkage unit, which links together current medical and educational data, for example. It is possible for us to have a relationship in every state between an historical research data set and the current data set, whereby a researcher can apply to get the two linked together by the data linkage unit, so they can go back 6, 7 generations. That's the state we want to get into. So it is possible to do this, and it's possible to do it ethically as well, using existing systems.
That's so cool. This is, yeah.
Very exciting. So we have run a little bit over time, so I just do have one last question, which is how can people help out? How can they get involved?
There are two ways. If you're in South Australia, contact Genealogy South Australia. So we're drawing a system up there. Otherwise, and if you're in South Australia and are just interested generally, follow the email link that will be circulated. I will work through those emails. If you want to volunteer, I'll put you in touch with Jodie Ombayo, who's our volunteer coordinator. When you get access to the database, we'll also show you where in the database all of our current volunteer projects are, so that there are various things that we're working on.
But I guess particularly for South Australians, join Genealogy SA and get on board with the volunteers here. And then when we have many people rowing in the same direction, we go faster. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for speaking today. We really appreciate it. Thanks to everyone attending, and thank you to everyone who was here online. We will see you next time.
Onwards and upwards.